Tonight we're going to be discussing very straightforward material, nothing we would say is lumdish, nothing complicated, but nonetheless very detailed, because the laws of Shemitah are not 1, 2, 3. And there's a lot of material in the laws of Shemitah, which is why sometimes it can get confusing. And there are many primers that are available that have been given out into different communities in Israel today, so that people know how to conduct themselves during the Shemitah year. As I mentioned to you last week, it's really 7 brief psukim at the beginning of Parshas Bahar that dictates the laws of Shemitah, which form the basis of what we need to know. Unfortunately, there's no Shulchan Aruch on Hilchos Shemitah, because the Shulchan Aruch is composed in the diaspora, where Shemitah was not really a daily concern. The Aruch HaShulchan, which was written at the end of the 19th century, wrote a separate compendium called the Aruch HaShulchan HaAsid, the future Aruch HaShulchan, or the Aruch HaShulchan for the future, which means that Rav Epstein, who wrote this, had tremendous foresight. He understood that even though for most of diaspora Jewry, many of the agricultural laws in Eretz Yisrael were not practicable in that particular moment, but they would become Be'ezras Hashem very soon, and certainly his foresight has proven to be very wise. So I divided the laws into really 4 parts. Maybe there's another way to divide them. The first part we want to look at tonight is the prohibition of working the soil. The second part, which is very detailed also, is the sanctity of Shemitah produce, which means anything that grows during the Shemitah year has to be treated a certain way. The third section is the hefker state of Shemitah produce and what a person must do in order to represent that the produce is ownerless, and perhaps a corollary of that, or perhaps it's a separate halacha, is the mitzvah of biur, of disposal or removal of Shemitah produce from his home at a certain time of the Shemitah year, which I don't know whether we're going to be able to get to all of these tonight. That's why I said this is part 1. We may have to defer to another evening in order to go through these halachas comprehensively. And this is even before we get to modern day piskei halacha about issues of how to deal with agriculture on a modern day basis. But first we want to just get a foundation and understand what the basic halachas are from the Rambam. So the Rambam really is going to form the foundation of where we get our halachas from. And in Hilchos Shemitah V'Yovel Perek Aleph, we'll just go through the first halacha straight. The Rambam writes, Mitzvahs aseh, this is source number 2. Mitzvahs aseh, lishbos me'avodas ha'aretz va'avodas ha'ilan b'shana shvi'is. It's a positive commandment from the Torah. 2, and remember we talked about last time, a couple of weeks ago, whether bisman hazeh it's d'oraisa or d'Rabbanan, we're not going to be differentiating for the purposes of our shiur tonight. A person is obligated to cease all working of the soil and working of trees, Vashana Hashvias, on the 7th year, Shenemar V'shavisa ha'aretz Shabbos L'Hashem, as the Torah says that the earth shall rest a Sabbath for Hashem. V'nemar V'charishu V'akotzir Tishbos, and it also says in another pasuk it says that for plowing and for harvesting you shall rest. So the Torah is addressing not only the earth having an obligation for it to be at rest, but it's also a commandment to the Jewish people that you must cease and desist from harvesting and plowing. The Chalaosa Melacha Me Avodas Haaretz O Ha'ilanos B'Shana Zu Bitel Mitzvahs Aseh Va'over Alos Aseh. Now, if a person violates the law and does not follow the laws of Shemitah and instead works the land, so he's in violation of both a mitzvahs aseh and a mitzvahs los aseh. So the mitzvahs aseh we just saw is becharishu v'akotzir tishbos. And what's the mitzvahs los aseh? Shenemar sadecha lo sizra v'charmecha lo sizmor. As it says, your field you may not plant, and your vineyard you may not prune. So you see that the Torah gives us also a negative, a mitzvahs los aseh, so it's a combination of an aseh and a los aseh. Halacha beis, Eino loke min haTorah ela al hazriya o al hazmira ve'al hakitzira o al habitzira. So the Rambam wants to point out to us that even when Shemitah is operative midioraisa, a person can never get malchus for a malacha of working the soil unless he does one of the following four things: planting, zemira is pruning, kitzira is harvesting crops, and bitzira is the specific act of harvesting grapes. Ve'echad hakerem ve'echad shar ha'ilanos, and this is true both for a vineyard and for other trees. All other acts, like we'll talk about, let's say watering and grafting and plowing and all of these other things, these are prohibited during the Shemitah year, but it's not a specific act that the Torah says that you're going to get malchus for. Halacha Gimel, uzumira bichlal ziriya, ubitzira bichlal ketzira. So the Rambam also points out to us that pruning is a form of planting, because when you prune, you're actually promoting the growth of the plant. So it's really a corollary of planting. And bitzira, which is grape harvest, is a corollary of standard harvest. V'lama pratan hakasuv. Why then did the Torah single out these two additional acts? Lomar lecha, because the Torah also says, I forget what the exact language, but it says lo sivtzor. Yes, I'm sorry. It says in Pasuk Hey, "Es sefiach kitzirecha lo sivtzor, ve'es inevei nizirecha lo sivtzor." It says that you may not do bitzira. It's Psukim Dalet and Hey. If you take a look, it says Sadecha lo sizra v'charnecha lo sizmor. It says your field you may not plant, your vineyard you may not prune, and the growths of your field you may not harvest, and the grapes of your field you may not be botzer, which is the grape harvest. So the Torah itemizes four verbs. Why then, if two of them are corollaries of the other two, why did the Torah have to specify them? Lomar lecha al shtei toldos elu bilvad hu chayav, ve'al sha'ar hatoldos shebavodas haaretz im shar ha'avos shelo nisparshu b'inyan zeh eino loke aleihen. That even if you could think of another activity that is a corollary of these acts, or any other kind of activity that has to do with working the soil or the trees, you're not going to get malchus for. Avol makino so makas mardus, but a person is not going to get off scot-free. The rabbis have the jurisdiction to penalize a person who is in blatant violation of Torah law, and so even though the Torah wants you to rest, and so you're in violation of a mitzvahs aseh, and you're not in violation of a mitzvahs los aseh, to the point where we can't give you malchus for what you've done, but nonetheless, the rabbis will give you rabbinic lashes. That's what they'll do. Halacha Dalet says, Keitzad hachofer o hachoresh letzarech hakarka. So what would be an example of something being liable for rabbinic lashes and not for biblical lashes? Let's say a person digs or a person plows for the needs of the soil. O hamisakel, or a person removes the stones. O hamizabel, or a person places down fertilizer. The chayotze bahen mishar avodas haaretz, and any other kind of work that involves the cultivation of the soil. V'chein hamavrich o hamarkiv o hanoteya. The chayotze ben me'avodas ha'ilanos, or if a person grafts, mavrich is you bend over a branch into the ground, or you graft two branches together, or you plant a branch, and anything of that like, makin oso makas mardus midivrehem. So that person would get not malchus midioraisa, but he gets rabbinic lashes. So now let's just skip to halacha ches, because the Rambam, we're just pulling out what I think is like the tamsit of the halacha. The Rambam in halacha ches says, mashkin beis hashlachim bashvius, v'hi sadeh hazriya shetzimeya biyoter. So the Rambam qualifies the prohibition of working the soil. And the Rambam tells us that you can do that which is necessary to save the agriculture from dying off completely. You're not allowed to cultivate, but there's a difference between cultivation and a minimal kind of work that just prevents the plant life from dying. or the ecosystem that's in the soil from dying. So therefore, what you are allowed to do is, if you have a field that is reliant upon irrigation in order for the plants to survive, you're allowed to do that. V'chein sedei ha'ilanot im hayu miruchakim zeh mizeh yeser me'eser lebeisa moshchen hasamayim me'ilan le'ilan. And similarly, if you have an orchard with trees, if the orchard is not densely populated, so then you're only allowed to bring the water to the specific tree in question. Aval lo yashku es kol hasada, but you are not allowed to irrigate the entire field. But if the trees are more densely positioned, and the Gemara discusses you need 10 in an area called a certain acreage called a BAYT, then you're allowed to irrigate the whole field. And also, if you, let's say, if you have trees, or you have an orchard that's growing in a certain kind of soil that's heavily reliant upon watering, because let's say it's a type of Middle Eastern soil that's almost like sand, right? So then you're also allowed to water it in order to prevent the trees from dying. So that's the minimum that you're allowed to do, but you're not allowed to do more than that to actually cultivate things from growing. Halacha Tes tells us a similar halacha. Ba'osin ukiot lagifanim, you're allowed to dig a trench, like a little circle around the vines. Ba'osin es amas hamayim katachilo, mamalin es hanikoyim mayim, you're allowed to create those little ducts in the soil to allow the water to naturally flow towards the vineyards, the vines. And all of this is, again, just to preserve the life of the vines that you are allowed to do. So the Rambam speaks it out. Why are these things permitted if working the soil is not? Because if we don't allow you to do that minimal kind of irrigation work, then everything in the field will die. The earth will become melecha, which is like salty, right? It'll become arid and salty, and then everything will die. The whole of Isser Hadvarim Ha'ilu B'Chayotzim Midivreihem Lo Gazru Al Elu She'ein Asr Min HaTorah Ela Osin Shnei Avos U'Shnei Toldos Shalahem Kamosha Bi'arnu. And therefore, since the other types of cultivation are not biblically prohibited, but only rabbinically prohibited, the rabbis did not only prohibited those specific acts of planting and harvesting, and they said nothing can be done as far as planting and harvesting that will cultivate the soil, but things that are rabbinically prohibited, we will allow you to do those things which will at least preserve the life of the agriculture during the Shemitah year. Okay?
You think Choresh is midrabanan?
Choresh, he seems to be saying, is midrabanan, yeah, because it's not, the Rambam had said, see, I'd originally thought that maybe there were other things that were aser mishum because of the mitzvahs aseh, because it says becharishu vakotzir tishbos. But the way that the Rambam understands it, I think based on the Gemara, is that during the plowing season and during the harvest season, you have to rest. It's not saying rest from harvesting. It's during that season you have to rest and not cultivate the soil. That seems to be the way the Rambam is understanding it. Okay, let's go on to the next halacha. We're skipping over now to Perek Gimel. And the Rambam writes in halacha Aleph in Perek Gimel in source number 3, Avoda sa'aretz b'shana shishis shaloshim yom samach lashvius asura halacha l'moshe misinai. So he points out to us that not only are you not allowed to work the soil during the Shemitah year, but you also have to desist from working the soil 30 days before Shemitah starts, during the month of Elul, this past Elul. Because by working the soil in Elul, you're actually preparing it and cultivating it for the Shemitah year. But this was only prohibited during the times of the temple, that it was a halacha l'moshe misinai, that there are certain things that you cannot do a month in advance. The gazru chachamim shelo yihiyu charshim sdei ilan erev shvius bisman hamikdash ela ad ha'atzeres ustei halavan ad ha'pesach. And the chachamim further added on to the halacha l'moshe misinai that you're not allowed to plow your field during the 6th year until after Shavuos, and you're not allowed to plant plow a wheat field until Pesach, because that's when the produce of the 6th year stops growing and doesn't need cultivation anymore. Once you start cultivating the field beyond the season of either Shavuos or Pesach, depending upon the harvest, depending upon the field, then it has the appearance that you're doing this for the 7th year. And that's why the Chachamim prohibited it, banned it even further than 30 days. But that's all when the temple was standing. Once the temple is destroyed, then you're allowed to work the field completely, all the way up to Rosh Hashanah itself. Now, what seems to be what comes out, and I just quoted just a little snippet from the Gemara. There's a machlokus in the Gemara as to how we know that you're not allowed to work 30 days before Rosh Hashanah in the 6th year. And there's a machlokus whether it's a pasuk or whether it's a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. The Rambam paskins like Rabbi Gamliel, who says that it's a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. And the halacha l'Moshe Misinai was that it's only operative, this ban of 30 days before, only during temple times. Now, why should that be? Because it's related to the nisuch hamayim. It's related to the water libation that only applies when there's a temple. Once there's no temple, there's no mitzvah of nisuch hamayim, which is also halacha l'Moshe Misinai, the water libation on the altar. And once that's no longer extant, then this ban on watering and cultivation during the 30 days before Shemitah also no longer applies. And that's what the Gemara says in Moed Katan. Okay, let's turn the page. Now we go to number 4. Again, halacha Yud Aleph of the same parak. Af bizman hazeh ein notin ilanos ve'ein markivin ve'ein mavrichin erev shavias ela kedei shetiklot hanatia b'tisha achar haklita lamed yom kodem Rosh Hashanah shel shvias. This is a rabbinic law. Again, because it has the appearance that if we allow you to plant too close to Shemitah, it'll appear as if this was grown during the Shemitah year and cultivated during the Shemitah year. So the rabbi said like this: you're not allowed to plant any new trees or to graft or to insert in the ground a new branch at the end of the 6th year, unless there's enough time for the new seed to catch and to start growing for 30 days after it takes root. So you have to give it enough time to take root, and then you have to give it an additional 30 days. And if that takes place before the Shemitah year starts, so then you're in time. But if you plant it too close to Rosh Hashanah, then it has a bad appearance. It has an appearance as if this was planted during Shemitah, and therefore rabbinically it's prohibited. And so like the Rambam writes, Ustam klita shtei Shabbatot. How long does it take for a tree or a seed to take root? Usually takes 2 weeks. And therefore you have to distance any new planting of trees 30 days plus 2 weeks, which would be 44 days. The reason why this is prohibited is so that an onlooker does not see this new sapling growing at the beginning of Shemitah year thinking that it was planted on Shemitah. So therefore, if it's planted 44 days or more before Rosh Hashanah, you can keep it, but pachos mikein ya'akor. But if it was planted after that time, you have to uproot it. Ve'im lo akar haperos mutarin. However, if you didn't uproot it, the fruit is still permitted. This is all rabbinic. Ve'imeis kodem shi'akor mechayvin es hayoresh la'akor. And if the planter died before he had a chance to uproot the tree, we tell his heirs to uproot it. Again, we don't want there to be any appearance of anything bad. The Gemara now says in Maseches Tainis an interesting halacha. Tanu Rabbanan Masriyan al ha'ilanos b'sha'ar shenei hashavua. Now, based on this principle that we're supposed to allow the land to grow fallow, there's an interesting shaila that's taken up by a number of poskim. Is it permitted to pray to Hashem for things to grow during Shemitah year? Is prayer a form of cultivation of the soil, or is it perfectly fine? In other words, if the Torah says God's objective is the land should remain fallow, land should not grow, then is this considered to be going against Hashem's plan?
Pray for rain.
You pray for rain, but you're not specifically because the world needs rain because the world needs water, right? But specifically to pray for the growth of agriculture may be something that's going directly against the Ratzon Hashem. So this is actually a discussion in the Gemara in Maseches Tainis, where the Brisa says, Masriyan al ha'ilanos b'sha'ar shnei shavua, that we're allowed to call a prayer service to pray that Hashem should grow the trees during 6 out of the 7 years. But al haboros ve'al hashichem al moros afilu b'shvius. You're allowed to pray for rain, that all of the wells should be filled so that we have a water supply. You can pray for even on Shemitah. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer Afal al Hilanos Bashvias Mipnei Sheyesh Behem Parnas Alaniyim. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, no, it's perfectly appropriate to pray for things to grow during Shemitah, because as we know, the produce, anything that grows during Shemitah belongs to the poor. So it is perfectly appropriate to pray that things should grow so that the poor have what to eat during the Shemitah year. Okay, so Dayan Weiss in Minchas Yitzchak says, Hinei lanias daiti hayanir ledaktek midivrei harosh ve'harambam ha'shulchan aruch l'svir lehu degam b'shvias masriyan, that they seem to paskin like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who permits you to daven even during a Shemitah year for produce. V'harosham ve'harambam v'tur shulchan aruch hishmitu hachiluk bein shar shnei hashvuah bein shnas shvias shma minod d'svir lehu de'ein lechalek. And then he says, V'chein asinu habadatz halacha l'maisa lifnei shavuayim be'erech. We did this, we the Badatz of Yerushalayim, we did this 14 years ago, Kishahaya Atziras Geshamim, when there was a drought, and it was during a Shemitah year. Upirsamnu Lomar Hatfila al HaGeshamim. And we publicized that people should pray for rain so that everything should grow. Maybe he means just 2 weeks ago. And therefore he says, may it be Hashem's will that our prayers are answered. Uvischus kiyum mitzvah shmita nizke shikiyam birkas haTorah devitzivisi es birchasi ulubias goyel tzedek b'mhera b'yameinu amen. He says, and in the merit of our observance of the mitzvah of Shemitah, may we merit to get the Torah's blessing of that God will give us the blessing of 3 years produce during the 6th year, and may we merit to see Mashiach b'mhera b'yameinu. The Aruch HaShulchan HaAsid also, just to add on to this prohibition of cultivation and working the soil, also adds another interesting facet. He says, "V'chol kayotze." He says the fourth word, "V'nirid v'chol ma she'aser b'shvius afilu al yedei akum aser." Umin haTorah. He says that which is prohibited to cultivate during the Shemitah year is also aser al yedei akum, meaning that even the Torah would prohibit you to have a Gentile work the soil for you. Now, normally, we know that let's say the Torah says you're not allowed to do malacha on Shabbos. The prohibition to have a Gentile do work for you on Shabbos, to have a Shabbos goy, is that midioraisa or midorabbanan? That's midorabbanan, it's a rabbinic law. But the Aruch HaShulchan says that the prohibition to have a goy work your field for you during Shemitah year is not just a rabbinic prohibition, it's a biblical prohibition. So what's the difference? He says, "V'lo dami l'Shabbos, da'amir la'akum shavus." He says it's not like Shabbos where instructing a goy to do work for you is only a rabbinic prohibition. He says, "Delo dami, de b'Shabbos malacha ne'esra v'lo shavisa sadeh." He says, on Shabbos, what does the Torah prohibit? It prohibits the man from working. But it doesn't prohibit there to be a cessation of work for the Shabbos. Right? The only subject of the mitzvah is the human being. Whereas by Shemitah, there are two subjects. One is the human being, and the other one is the land. So therefore, his observation is, Masha'enkein b'shvias sheshavisa sadeh hi ha-mitzvah. He says, Becharish uvakatzir tishbos is one thing, but there shall be a Shabbos Lashem, the land, v'shavasa ha'aretz Shabbos Lashem, that the land itself has an obligation to rest. And therefore, imkein mali al yado al yedei akum sof sof over al shavisa ha'aretz. It's an interesting chiddush, but he says that proves to me that as long as the land is not at rest, there's a violation of the biblical law, And therefore, even if you ask a goy to do it for you, you're in violation of the halacha. But we have to be very clear and precise. A Gentile is not chayiv in taryag mitzvahs. So if the Gentile were to take his own property in Eretz Yisrael and work the soil during Shemitah, he's not in violation of Shemitah, right? It's only that when the land is owned by a Jew, do we say that the land has an obligation to rest? Yes?
But we know by Tumas L'Mais, for example, the machlekes, if the ownership of the goy is enough to remove it from the rules of Tumas L'Mais, I'm wondering if the same thing by Shemitah applies as well.
Right. So, we'll get more in depth into that when we learn about the history of the Heter Mechira in another shiur. But al zeh anu danim. This is exactly what we're deliberating over. We'll look in the halach in the Rambam in a second about Gentile-owned property. Marv?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
Okay, so let's take a look at source number 8, where the Rambam writes in Perek Daled in Hilchos Shemittah v'Yovel, halacha chavtes, he says, Akum shekana karka be'eretz Yisrael v'zara b'ashviyas, peroseha mutarin. If a Gentile purchases soil in Eretz Yisrael and he plants in it during the Shemitah year, even though normally the rabbis banned all produce that was cultivated by a Jew during the Shemitah year, they did not ban the produce that was cultivated by a goy. Shelo gazru ala svichim ela bipnei ovrei aveira, v'ha'akum eno mitzuven ala shviyas kedei shenigzor aleihem. The whole reason why the rabbis prohibited even free growths that are not a product of cultivation under certain conditions is because of people were worried that if we allow people to capitalize off of produce that grows on its own during Shemitah, people will come to cultivate the soil. But that's only a concern for a Jewish-owned field. If a Gentile owns a field, there's no obligation for him to make sure that the land is resting. In other words, the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, seemingly, according to the Rambam, only applies, the Kedusha of the land is only extant when it's in the possession of a Jew. Once the land is no longer in the possession of a Jew, it loses its Kedusha, at least vis-a-vis Shemitah. And to the point where you can even buy the produce from the goy. And so this is really, this halach in the Rambam is the basis for the whole din of the Heter Mechira that was put into practice in the earlier days of the 20th century. Now, so that's just a primer on the prohibition of working the soil during the Shemitah year. Let's jump to the sanctity of Shemitah produce during the Shemitah year. That which grows during the Shemitah year is considered to be sanctified. So here we go to the Rambam, and once again in Perek Daled, and here it is in Halacha Aleph. The Rambam writes, Kol shetotzi haaretz b'shana hashvius, bein min hazera shenafal ba mikodem shvius, bein min ha'ikarim sheniktru mikodem v'chazru v'asu u'shneihem nikru safiach. He says, anything that grows during the 7th year, and it doesn't matter whether it just is a product of a seed that fell into the ground before Shemitah, or whether it was something that was harvested before Shemitah and some remnant of the plant remained in the ground and continued growing. And those are called sefichim. Those are wild growing produce. And when I say wild growing, I mean it grows on its own without cultivation. Bein min ha'asavim v'ha'yirako sha'alu me'elehen ve'ein lahem zera, or if it's a type of herb or vegetable that just grew on its own and it doesn't require planting, ha'kol muter la'achlo min ha'torah. These things are permitted for consumption. Shenamar v'ha'yisa shabbos ha'aretz lachem la'achla. Because after all, what does the Torah say? It shall be a Sabbath for you, but the produce is for you to eat. In other words, the Torah never means to ban the produce that grows during Shemitah. It only doesn't want you to cultivate it. And even if a field was cultivated during a Shemitah year and its produce grew, technically from the biblical standpoint, that produce is permitted. That the Torah says, do not harvest in the normative way that you harvest your produce. But v'im kotzar kederach hakotzrin lokeh. And if you do harvest in the normative way, you're going to get malchus. Kegon shekotzar kol hasadeh v'hem mid kri v'dosh babakar. So, for example, if a person harvests the entire field at one time, and he puts all the grain or the other produce that he harvests puts in a pile, and he threshes using cattle and so forth, so then of course he gets malchus. Oshakotzer lavodas haaretz kamo shebi'arnu, elakotzer ma'at ma'at v'chovet v'ochel. But rather, what the Torah is telling you to do is to harvest a little bit at a time, and by harvesting a little bit at a time, you are allowed to eat the produce. The Torah does not want to limit you from eating the produce. It just doesn't want you to cultivate and work the soil in a normative fashion. Okay, let's go on to the next page. In Halacha Beis of that same chapter, the Rambam writes, "Umei divrei sofrim," but then the rabbis came along and they made the following halacha: "She'iyu kol hasafichim asurim ba'achila," that anything that grows naturally on its own is not allowed to be eaten. V'lama gazru aleihem mipnei ovrei aveira, and the reason why the rabbis prohibited this is because of sinners. Shelo yelech v'yizra tevua v'kitnios v'zir'onegina b'soch sadeu b'seiser, because we don't want people to go surreptitiously and plant when no one's looking. And then when they grow on their own, the person will say, "Oh, these were wild, naturally growing beans, magically growing beans, and therefore I'm not in violation. They're just naturally growing, and therefore I'll eat them." And therefore the rabbis banned anything that grows naturally on its own of the produce during the Shemitah year. So what does that mean? Halamadata she'ein ochlim miperos shavias ela peros ha'ilanos. So therefore the rule is like this, that during the Shemitah year certain kinds of produce are prohibited rabbinically and other kinds of produce are completely permitted. So we've said that things that are reliant on planting, so even if they grow on their own, are going to be rabbinically prohibited. But things that are trees, fruit that grows on trees, or herbs that do not rely on planting, those things are allowed to be consumed during Shemitah, even rabbinically. So therefore, he says, "She'ein ochlim miperos shvius ela peros ha'ilanos v'ha'asavim she'ein zorin osom rov ha'adam." Things that most people wouldn't plant, but that they grow on their own. What kind of, like wild grass that grows on its own, you're allowed to consume, and tree fruit you're allowed to consume. Kegon hapigam v'hayarbuzin hashotim v'chol kayotzi bahem. Wild growing, I don't know what these different species are. So, by the way, he also, the poskim also permit all types of mushrooms and truffles because those are not considered to be product of the soil. But he says, "Aval hayirakot shederach rov ha'adam l'zoram beganos umine tevua v'kitnios kol hatzomeach mehen osam medivreihem v'amalaktan makin oso makas mardus." But vegetables, where people normally plant vegetables in gardens, and all different kinds of grain and beans, then anything that grows during the Shemitah year is prohibited, is banned. The only things that are permitted as far as produce from Eretz Yisrael are fruit from trees and wild growing herbs that are not planted to begin with. Now, how this translates in modern agriculture in Eretz Yisrael today, not sure yet. But it would seem that any kind of wheat field has to remain fallow midrabanan during Shemitah. We'll get to different provisions that are made as far as all of these other issues that there may be provisions, but certainly fruit you're allowed to consume during the Shemitah year that grows in Eretz Yisrael. Let's go on to the next parak of the Rambam in source number 10. Now we're up to parak Hey. Halacha Aleph. The Rambam writes, "Peros shevias nitnu la'achila v'lashtia v'lasicha ula'adlakas haner v'latzivia." But once we give you permission to consume the fruit of Shemitah, you're allowed to eat it, drink it. You can use the produce, let's say the oils from the fruit, as to make oil from, to anoint yourself, to perfume yourself. You can use it, let's say the olives that grow during Shemitah, you can use for oil for fuel, and you can also use it for making dyes. And that's based on Chazal. And Halacha Beis writes, La'achila v'lashtia keitzad, le'echol davar shedarko le'echol, v'lishtos davar shedarko lishtos, kedin truma u'maiser sheni. He says, but you have to treat it with the sanctity that you have to treat it in its normal method of consumption. If a fruit is normally eaten, then you cannot turn it into a beverage. If it's normally a beverage, you cannot eat it as a fruit. Let's say if it's normal to, let's say, harvest grapes for their wine, you cannot eat the Shemitah grapes as a fruit. You have to turn it into a beverage.
Something that has both functions.
So apparently if it has both functions, the Rambam does address this, but at some point later on, if it has both functions, so then you can say, what was it planted for?
Is this a fruit that grows during the Shemitah, does it have a din of Meiser?
No, there's no Trumas and Meisers during Shemitah.
Because it's Hefker.
Because it's Hefker, yeah. Halacha Gimel. V'lo yishane perot mibriyatam kederach she'eno mishana b'truma meiser sheni. Davar shedarko le'achel chai lo yachlen u'vushal. So just like by the laws of Truma and Meiser Sheni produce, you have to treat it with a certain sanctity. So you have to eat it in its normal method of consumption. And so therefore, also by Shemitah produce, if it's normally eaten raw, you're not allowed to eat it cooked. And if it's normally consumed cooked, you're not allowed to eat it raw. And therefore you're not allowed to boil certain kinds of produce that are normally consumed by animals. Nor are you allowed to take cooked food that's already spoiled and eat it if it has Shemitah produce in it. Or to take moldy bread, if it's from the Shemitah year, since this is not the normal method of eating it, so then you're not allowed to eat it, just like you're not allowed to eat Truma and Meiser in that state. Halacha Hey, Peros hamiyuchadim l'maychol adam ein machilan oso lebehema l'chayev la'ofos. Produce that is designated for human consumption cannot be given to animals to eat or to birds. And therefore, like for example, even today they will tell you that if you have Shemitah produce, you can't, feed it to the birds. Right? You can't say take crumbs that have Shemitah status and feed them to the birds. Halcha habehema me'eleha l'tachas hate'ena va'achla ein machayven oso lahachazira. That if a bird goes ahead and steals some figs on its own, you don't require the bird to bring it back. Because the Torah, after all, says that once it's out in the field, it's hefker and it belongs to all the animals. In other words, you're not obligated to try and preserve the sanctity by taking something that's normally eaten by humans. If an animal runs off with it, it's done. In Halacha Yud Aleph, the Rambam writes, "Klal gadol amr beperos shavias kol shu miyuchad l'maychal adam." And that anything is specified for human consumption, kagon chitim te'enim va'anavim v'chayotzi bahen. That's like wheat, figs, grapes, and the like. Ein osim mimenu melugma or retia v'chayotzi. But you're not allowed to convert it into a non-food item that would be used for, let's say, medicinal purposes. Afilu la'adam, and this is true even for human beings. Shenemar lachem la'achla, kol shum yuchad lachem yiyeh la'achla v'lo l'refua. Because the Torah says that the produce is supposed to be for eating. It's not supposed to be for other purposes. But that's only if it's meant as a food item. B'chol she'enam yuchad l'maychal adam kagon kotzim v'dardarim harakim osim hemelugma la'adam avalo l'behema. But if you have something that grows from the ground, let's say a thorn or an herb that would normally not, a weed that would normally not be eaten, then even though it has Shemitah status, you're allowed to make it as a medicine. You can use it to turn into a medicinal herb, but you can only do that for human beings. You can't do that for animals. And if a certain a wild herb or weed grows from the ground, and it's not meant for really anything, it's just there as like tumbleweed or like azov, as hyssop brush, right? He says, then it all depends on your thinking process. If your thinking was that if hyssop bush grows, I'll use it for fuel, so then you're allowed to use it to burn as fuel. La'achila harehu keperos, but if your thinking is I want to consume it for food, then you can use it as fruit. L'maychol adam l'maychol behema nosna lav chumrei maychol adam shein osam emelugma v'chumrei maychol behema shein sholkin oso. And it could be used for both. In other words, let's say when you have in mind when this thing is growing in your yard, you say, oh, this is great, I'll use it for both myself and for my animals. So then you can use it only, for your animal. You can use it for your animals for feed, and you can use it for yourself to make medicine out of it. Halacha Yud Beis, mutter limkor ochlei adam v'ochlei behema v'likach behem ochlei adam. So you're allowed to take animal food and that you have a surplus of, and you're allowed to take animal food and human food and use it and barter with it. You can exchange it in order to purchase other kinds of food. So this is another chiddush that we have in Hilchos Shemittah, that at times you are allowed to sell Shemittah produce as long as you're going to be using the proceeds of the Shemittah produce and treat it with the kedusha of Shemittah. Aval ein mochrin ochlei behema likach behen ochlei behema acheres. You're not allowed to sell animal feed in order to purchase other animal feed. Ve'ein tzarich lomar she'ein mochrin ochlei adam likach behen ochlei behema. Nor are you allowed to sell human food in order to purchase animal feed. And if you do, you're limited in the way that you can use it. Halacha Yud Gimel, Peiro Shvius, Ein Motzian Osan Me Haaretz L'chutz La'aretz, Va'afilu L'Surya. Another restriction. Shemitah produce may never be removed from Eretz Yisrael. And you're not even allowed to take it to Surya, which has some level of Kedushas Haaretz, even though it was annexed at some later point. Nor are you allowed to give to eat from Shemitah produce to a non-Jew. Shemitah produce can only be eaten by a Jew, and it can only be eaten inside of Eretz Yisrael. So any kind of export of Israeli produce is absolutely forbidden during the Shemitah year. V'im hayas sachir Shabbos o schir shana o schir chodesh o shekotzatz mizonosav alav harehu ka'anshe beis u'machilan oso. The exception is when it comes to a Gentile, is if the person is an employee of yours that is under a long-term contract, such that you've employed him for a week, a month, a year, and the like, then he becomes like a member of your household, and then you are allowed to feed him Shemitah produce. U'machilan es ha'achsanya pero shavias, and you're allowed to feed guests Shemitah produce as well. And I believe, although I'm not 100% sure, that if someone is a guest in your home that's not Jewish, it sounds like the Rambam is saying that it's permitted to feed them as well, Shemitah produce. Halacha Yud Zayin, muter lakutz ilanot le'itzim b'shvias kodem shiyeh bahen puri. You're allowed to chop wood off of a tree in order to use it as fuel. This is not a violation of a destruction of Shemitah items during Shemitah, as long as you're not harvesting the wood before the fruit grows. The Torah says that you can use Shemitah produce for food, but you can't wantonly destroy it. So as long as you cut off the branches of a fruit tree before it starts growing fruit, it's okay. But once it starts to grow fruit, you're not allowed to destroy the fruit to use it for any other utility. V'imhotzi peros v'higiu la'onas ha'maisros muter lakutzoso shreihotzi perosa v'uvatel din shavias mimenu. But if it already produced its fruit, and I'm not really sure I understand this line in the Rambam, but it reached the point in the season where the fruit has reached maturity, then you're allowed to cut off the branch, and because the branch is no longer going to be producing any fruit anymore during that Shemitah year, and therefore there's no longer a din of preserving the branch for Shemitah. Halacha Yutes, Ein Sorfin Tevin V'Kashel Shvius Mipnei Shu Roy L'Maichel Behema. You're not allowed to burn straw or hay that grew during Shemitah, because that's meant for animal feed. And anything that's meant for food, either for humans or for animals, cannot be destroyed. And therefore, he writes, you can't use it as fuel. Avol masikin begefes uvizagin shel shvius, but that you could use for fuel things that are no longer edible, such as grape seeds. Those are allowed to be. Yeah.
With respect to anything that's taken out of Israel and not being able to eat it, is there how do we deal with that on a practical level if you go into a supermarket and say, is this from Israel? And then, oh, I'm not going to buy it. What type of message are we sending, for example, by doing that outright versus, I mean, are there any halachic implications in terms of...
Well, in a regular year, when the Trumas and Maasros are extant and you're allowed to eat the produce, so then it's not an issue. What would be optimal is if the supermarket would be trained to take Trumas and Maasros. But during a Shemitah year, the produce is usher. Once it leaves Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to consume it. And therefore, you're doing the right thing by boycotting it. You don't want to support people who are in violation of halacha by exporting produce. In other words, we want even the non-religious to observe the Shemitah law. We should not be aiding and abetting people who, just because we're patriotic Israelis and we want to support the Israeli economy, it should not come at the expense of the Shemitah, the Hilchos Shemittah, right? So we can't encourage people who are avrayanim, who are in violation of halacha, by purchasing Shemitah. Okay.
Is it also to actually buy that?
It would seem to me that it would be usher to buy it because you're aiding and abetting an avrayan. You're misayeh yedei ovrei avera. You're helping people who are illegally exporting produce. They're in violation of
Is
halacha.
one required to inquire as to where the fruit is from? So if you
Unless you know that the produce is from Israel, you're not obligated to be choshesh. But it is worthwhile if you know that there's a certain kind of produce that is in high quantity from Eretz Yisrael. Like in certain seasons, a lot of peppers come from Israel. So then it's worthwhile to inquire. A lot of times the COR will come out with an alert, and they'll tell you, don't stay away from this store where someone saw a label that said that it's a produce of Israel.
I think it's somebody's...
Would this extend to wine?
Pulls things and they don't allow certain...
In Sobeys, I'm told that the mashgiach does pull things, yeah.
Rather, would this extend to wine?
Sure it extends to wine. Shemitah, the wine that is from grapes of Shemitah, I believe it will also extend to, yeah.
So that means that there's no wine being produced this year by any of the wineries in Israel?
Unless they're producing it for domestic consumption. I don't know how we would get around it.
There are some wineries actually that import grapes from Argentina and places like that into Israel to continue to make wine.
Interesting.
So they don't lose their customers during that year.
Isn't that interesting? Okay. So
Does it.
I don't know the specifics of what everything that's done in Eretz Yisrael today. Mark.
Would it be okay if the Israeli exporter was a non-Jew or a corporation that was owned mostly by non-Jews?
It would certainly potentially mitigate the problem, but then you get into the whole issue of does heter mechira work, or are we allowed to rely on it? Which is just like we sell our chametz before Pesach, can we sell our land before Shemitah? Once it belongs to a Gentile, it no longer has kedusha shvius, and then it would be okay to export it, but we'll have to get into that in a future shiur when we talk about the heter mechira.
Doesn't the Ministry of Agriculture have like laws about this in Eretz Yisrael?
I don't know.
They don't
Let me know what you find out. Let me know what you find out. I don't know. We're just learning the basics now. Tonight we're just learning the basics. In Perek Vav in Hilchos Shemittah, the Rambam writes, Halacha Aleph as follows: Ein osin schora b'peros shvius. You're not allowed to engage in business using Shemitah produce. V'imrotza limkor ma'at miperos shvius mocher. You can sell it in small quantities, however. Whatever you purchase from that money has to be food, and that food has to be treated just like it's the produce of Shemitah. Va'oso hapri hanimkar harehu b'kedushaso kishaya. What's unique about Shemitah is that normally when you transfer kedusha from something that's hektish onto coinage, the coin becomes holy, and the original object has its kedusha removed from it. But that's not the case by Shemitah. Shemitah always retains its kedusha even after it's been transferred to money. So that's a special chumrah by Shemitah. Let's turn the page. Okay. Let's go to again back to Perek Daled in Hilchos Shemitah. The Rambam writes in Halacha Chaf Daled, this is the mitzvah to declare your field to be hefker during the Shemitah year. Mitzvahs aseh lahashmit kol ma shetotzi haaretz bashvius. It's a mitzvah to declare ownerless and to absolve yourself of anything that grows in the land on Shemitah. Shene'amar v'hashavius tishmetena unetashta ve'achlu evyonei amecha. That during the Shemitah year, you have an obligation to relinquish it and leave it alone. B'chol hanoel karmo osag sadeu bashvius bitol mitzvahs aseh. And therefore, if a person locks up his vineyard and prevents people from access to his field, so then he is again in violation of the mitzvahs aseh. V'chein im asaf kol pirosav l'soch beso. Or if a person harvests everything that grows in the Shemitah year and brings everything into the house without giving free access to anyone outside, you're also in violation. Ella, or rather, what do you have to do on Shemitah? Yafkir hakol v'yad hakol shavin b'chol makom shenemar ve'achlu evyonei amecha. And therefore, you have to, anything that does grow during Shemitah, where you have a heter to eat it, has to belong to everyone equally. You cannot hoard it. You cannot bring it into your house and lock it up. It has to be accessible to everyone. The only thing that you're allowed to bring into your house is in small quantities, just like if you found something that's hefker, you wouldn't be allowed to hoard it all for yourself. It belongs to the public. So too, you view your produce as not yours, but it belongs to the public. So bring in what you need for the meals for the day, and then you can go out tomorrow, and whatever's left you can go get also. Chomesh kadei shemen, chamesh kadei shamen, chamisha asar kadei yayin, and the Rambam tells us what's the measurement. 5 jugs of oil is what you're allowed to bring into your field into your house at a time. 15 jugs of wine at a time, or bottles of wine at a time. V'im hevi yeser mizeh mutar. If b'di'evid you brought in more, then b'di'evid it's mutar, but you still should not do it. Now, this is based on this whole idea of declaring your stuff ownerless is based on a Mishnah in Maseches Idios, and what it tells us is that the people who come to your field are not even allowed to express their gratitude. Or the way that the Mishnah at Idios writes it is, Ochlin peros shavias bitova v'shalo bitova kedivrei beishamai ubesilal omrim ein ochlim ela bitova. Now, what do those words mean? You're supposed to eat the peros of Shemitah either with tova or not with tova, and according to Beis Hillel, you can only eat it with tova. What does tova mean? Okay, so the Tosfos Yantif quotes from the Ravid, and he says, "V'nirali de taimayu de Beis Hillel mishum de gazri shvius atu shar shnei shavua, kidei shelo yehi adam ragil likanes b'stei chaveru uv'ginaso v'pardeso shelo mida'ato, avol min haTorah vadai mutar." So basically what Beis Hillel is saying is that on the Shemitah year, when you come into a person's house, it has to be with tova, or you come into his field, which means you have to say hello to him, and you have to say, is it okay if I take? Now, really, min haTorah, you don't have to ask him for permission because it's hefker. But the reason why the rabbis were gozer, according to Beis Hillel, that you have to ask reshus before you take, is because we're worried that if you go into his field during Shemitah and just stam take, we're worried that next year you're going to do the same thing. So we want to make sure that you don't become a grubber, right, of some other people's property just because it's Shemitah. And so therefore Beis Hillel were gozer that you have to at least say, please, sir, may I have some more? Okay, Dirsiv, as it says...
Is in the field, or do you have to go find them?
That's an interesting question. Or maybe, let's say he puts up a sign, says, Shemitah, please take. Then it could be that maybe you don't have to. I don't know. Dirsivu b'shana hashvius tishmetena v'tanya b'mechilta magid shehu poretz ba'paratzot ela shegadru chachamim b'nei tikun ha'olam ad kan. So the Ravid just writes, he says, really midyoraisa, a person can even break into a field. Like even if the field is locked up, you're allowed to actually bust down the fence in order to get in because it's rightfully yours. All the produce belongs to the public. But the Chachamim made a takana that we don't want to engender this kind of behavior for non-Shemitah years, and therefore you have to just say please.
Is there a formula for how to be mafkir your sadeh, like for...
Right, so it's a machlokus in the poskim actually whether you have to recite a formula or not. Is there an obligation to verbalize that it's hefker, or is it just demonstrated by leaving the produce out in the field? That's not, so that's a machlokus in the poskim. Okay. The mitzvah of biur, I think I'm going to leave for another time, but it's really a corollary of this idea that things are hefker, which means that at a certain point in the season, if produce is no longer is considered to be it's past its season out in the field, such that people cannot find this type of produce out in the field because it's rotting already, then you're not allowed to store it in your house. You have to actually remove it from your house and leave it outside. And there's a big machlokus between the Rambam and the Ramban what the mitzvah of biur is. We'll see later on. The Rambam holds that the mitzvah of biur is you actually have to destroy the produce, but the Ramban says no, the mitzvah is just to make it hefker and take it out of your house and leave it for the public for consumption. But we'll talk about that later on. This is really, again, just a rudimentary. I'm still clueless about a number of things in Hilchos Shemittah, but this is sort of just a cursory review of some of the basic halachos, and then in a future shiur we're going to go to some very practical applications of these halachos. This is sort of the foundation work. Okay.